Doesn't get better than that. Good morning. It's Tuesday, December 4th. Today?
Yes.
Today's December 4th. I should know that. Yesterday was my mother's birthday. She would have been 89. Actually, I say she would have been 89. There is a debate among the rabbis whether when somebody dies, whether they're still aging. And I'm not going to get into it now. We'll discuss it another time. But she would have been 89. 89 is actually the gematria of Hanukkah. She was born on Hanukkah.
Oh, wow.
Yesterday was her English birthday. Next week, Monday, Sunday night, when we light the second candle, she would have been 89. There is a difference whether, like you may ask, what's the difference if she ages or not? There could come out a halachic difference whether a person ages after they passed. And we'll get into it another time, but it's an interesting shiur that I could give on that. Okay. Okay, so let me ask you, if I was to ask you or anybody else, what do you think the worst crime, the worst aveira is in the world? The worst, absolute worst.
Murder. Murder.
No.
You would say murder.
I would say embarrassing somebody.
Okay, you're both correct, and that's what the subject of the shiur.
Yeah, because it's like murder when you do that.
Right.
The blood comes to their
Right.
face. See, we're not too stupid.
No. TWO or TOO? We're not too stupid.
Either one.
Okay.
And actually, we are. So.
Don't confuse me.
Right. We actually, where we left off when I first started giving this shiur in halacha was by the laws pertaining to calling up somebody to the Torah who's allowed to be called, and so on and so forth. And we also discussed another interesting law that when the Torah has to be read, and it has to be read perfectly, and what happens if somebody, the Baal Korah, the person reading, makes a mistake, what happens? So if you've been to different shuls, and I have been, where you get all kinds of commotion, and people like stampede on him, and like, wow, we made a big mistake, and to correct it, like all of a sudden everybody becomes the holiest person in the world, and if you mispronounce a word or something, So there is a debate what you're supposed to do actually in such a case. And I'm not making a ruling right now, but there is sufficient basis and sufficient halachic brought down in various sforim and various books of law that you don't correct him because you can embarrass him. And embarrassing him is worse than not reading the Torah correctly.
Well, then how could there be a law that you have to read the Torah correctly? Because eventually someone will make a mistake.
Okay, so good question, and the answer is that first of all, you shouldn't have everybody correct him because it looks horrible and it's really embarrassing. And maybe just the person standing next to him should correct him, and he should be very careful what he should correct him with or not. And he should know the laws as to what is correctable and what needs to be corrected and what isn't. For example, we have the word S in the Torah a lot. It's probably the most common word. Sometimes it's S and sometimes it's ace. Okay, sometimes with a triangle, 3 dots, and sometimes with 2.
You have to know when you're reading the Torah because there's no cancellations in there.
There's no punctuations.
So you have to know.
So you have to know. Yeah, so a good Baal Korah will know that. And there is a lot of differences between S and ace. And we can talk about that another time. Whenever I say we can talk about another time, write down those things, and then because
all the things you say we'll talk about another time. So very interesting.
We can talk about it, when I'm in the pizza store and just asking what's the difference between S and ace, and I'll tell you.
Okay.
But nevertheless, that need not be corrected, and certainly it shouldn't be a basis for embarrassing somebody. So you should be careful who does it, how it's done, and when it's done, and so on and so forth. If he says a word which is totally inconsistent in what it says, then you should really correct him. Although it's brought down in halacha that there is an opinion that even if you make a gross mistake, and it gives you two examples of gross mistakes. One example, it gives you where you said Avram instead of Avraham. Okay, so that's one mistake. And then also tells you instead of saying Aharon, he doesn't realize it and says Choran. Choran was not a good guy. Aaron was a good guy. So even he says even in those cases you don't correct him. So we can see the lesson of this. Now, where does it all come from? I'll show you the Old Testament. Some people refer to it as the Torah. And you will not find in there anywhere not to embarrass somebody. So is the prohibition of embarrassing somebody, is it biblical? Is it rabbinical? Is it just a custom? Is it just a nice thing for us not to do? Is it just like common decency?
Does it come from the oral tradition?
Does it come from the oral? That's what I said. Is it rabbinical? Does it come from oral? So where does it come from? So the first place we see this magnified in the Torah, although not certainly specific, the first place we see that is in this week's Parsha. Okay? We have the story of Yehuda, who had several sons, Onan, and Shiloh. And his first son got married to a woman by the name of Tamar. You familiar with that story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, when we were in yeshiva growing up, and I was a little kid, that story was rated X, and we skipped that, because it involved some sexual and incestuous relations, and we were, I guess, too young to comprehend that. And of course, every time we skipped something, that's when I went home and I really looked it up, and I wanted to know what exactly was going on, and I just didn't understand it. Anyway, so Yehuda had a son, and he got married, and he died. So he told his daughter-in-law Tamar, he says, "Marry my other son," and that's by the way the law that if somebody dies and leaves a brother and didn't leave any children, there's a mitzvah for that brother to marry his sister-in-law.
You have to do the whole thing with the shiur.
If he doesn't want to do it, you got to do the whole thing. It's called a chalitza. So this brother did not want to marry her, and the reason he didn't want to marry her because he said that he knows that the children he will bear would not really be his. It's going to be for his brother. So in effect, they will not be his kids. So the Torah uses a language that he let his seed spill on the floor because he didn't want to impregnate her. And so he died for that too. So in Yehuda's mind, he says, okay, I have a third son. Let me wait till he grows up a little older and, she'll marry him. But because at that time it was very important not to go outside the family. People married within the family, not necessarily your deceased siblings,
But to keep the land
but
and
keep
everything,
it together exactly. So one day, and he was very depressed, Yehuda, and this is all in the Torah, and one day he was going and he sees what he thinks is a prostitute on the road, and he cohabitates with her, and she tells him, you owe me what you owe me. What are you going to give me if I sleep with you? And he said, I'm going to send you a goat or something. And he didn't have it with him because, unlike Tad, not too many people walk around with goats. So he gave her. This is the daughter-in-law, but he didn't know. He didn't know. So he gave her he gave her some, like a mashkin, how do you call that, collateral. He says, hold this. So he gave her, let's say, a few things. One of the things he gave a staff. So let's say he gave her a staff and something else. So a few months later, rumor goes about town that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, is with child. She's 3 months pregnant, and she's 3 months pregnant, and Yehuda is very, very embarrassed that his daughter-in-law did such a horrible thing. She went and slept with somebody, so he orders her that she has to be taken out and burned at the stake. Okay? And the Torah uses, and this is, look at the word, and the Torah says, he mutza'as, he said, she shall be taken out, V'hi shilcha el chameh lemor, and she said, let the man who this staff belongs to, he is the one that is the father of my child.
So of course it takes a look at that.
So the question is, so the Gemara says in Bava Metzia, as well as a whole bunch of other places, the Gemara says that, like, why did she go beat around the bush? Why didn't she say, hey, I didn't go outside the family, it's my father-in-law that I slept with. Mm-hmm. It would have been embarrassing. Right. I mean, there was, but nevertheless, it would have saved her life. So the Gemara says something, Noach lo la'odem, it is easier, it is better, it is more meritorious for a person to be burned at the stake than to embarrass somebody in public. Actually, there's a question whether even in private, but we'll get to that in a minute. So she did not want to embarrass Yehuda and didn't want to say his name, so she just says, let the person I slept, let the staff that I'm holding in my hand, that's who impregnated me.
So it left it up to him to...
So it left it up to him to admit it.
Right.
So, unbelievable.
Yeah.
The Gemara says, the halacha is, I need that.
No, just what it's the word.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I want you to look at that word, humutza'as. He says,
Which pasuk was that?
here. No, I moved it away from the place already.
Sorry.
Okay, Okay, so the Torah is telling. She put herself in a position that she could have gotten killed. But she risked her life because she didn't want to embarrass somebody. Of course, later on, Yehuda admitted that it was him, and of course, she got saved. Mm-hmm. So we see from this that how horrible it is to embarrass somebody, that rather you should let yourself get killed. So actually there are rabbis that said, how do we see that from there? How do you know they would have burnt her? Maybe at the last second she would have, she just said they were getting ready to burn her. She says, look, the person that this belongs to stay. If they would put her up there and they would light the fire and douse her with gasoline, and start burning her, then maybe she would have. Maybe there is no rule like that. Maybe you should not risk your life. So it's very interesting that when the Gemara brings down this story and it says the word he mutza'as, which means she should be taken out, Tosfos says the same thing and says the word hu mutza'as and leaves out the aleph. With the aleph, it means she should be taken out. Vayetze means to taken out. It has an aleph. Tosfos leaves out the aleph. Not only does he leave it out, he says specifically, he mutza'as, below aleph. I'm taking out the aleph. Why? Because then it means something else. Then it means, like in Eicha, where it says that the Beis HaMikdash was burned, it says, Vayitzas Eish B'Tzion, that they burned with fire Tzion Yerushalayim. And without the aleph, it means that they burned. And from this, we learn out that no, she did.
She would not
She was already being burned. And even when she was being burned, there was already had lit her, and the fire was already flaming underneath her. Still, at that point, she says, "Let the person who this staff belongs to, that's the one that I cohabitated with," and still she was not ready to publicly embarrass Yehuda. Now, where do we get that from? Where did she get that from? Like I said, is it in the Torah? Where does it say you can't embarrass somebody? So it says actually in Parshas Kedoshim. In Parshas Kedoshim it says that if you see your friend doing something wrong, it says, I'll read it in English, you shall reprove your fellow. Morgan, Shalom Aleichem. He says, you shall reprove. If you see your friend doing something wrong, you should talk to him. You should reprove him. You know what the word reprove means, right? You shall reprove him. But what does it say afterwards? V'lo sisa olav chet. You shall reprove your fellow and do not bear a sin because of him. Now, what does that mean? You see him doing something wrong. The Torah tells us that you should correct him. You should reprove him, so that you shall not bear a sin because of him.
I always thought that if you see something, you're as guilty as the person doing it unless you stop them. So that's what I thought that meant.
Okay, so it probably means that as well. But Rashi right away says, what does it mean? You should not bear a sin. It says, Lo malbenes pnei barabim. Don't embarrass him in public, because if you do, then you will get a sin. So be careful how you criticize somebody and how you correct somebody and how you point something out to somebody that he did something wrong.
So you pull someone aside to reproach them.
Yeah.
You can still embarrass them, even though it's one-on-one.
Okay,
they can be embarrassed just in front of you.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to say. So the Torah is telling us that even exactly what the point that I'm making, that even if you're criticizing, you're correcting somebody, if you're complaining to somebody, somebody did you an injustice, and you want to, bring it up and talk to him about it, even on a one-to-one thing, you should not embarrass him. And it's very difficult, and people struggle with that, and I struggle with that, especially when you have, like somebody in shul, did something wrong to you, you want to just tell him off. You feel you're 100% right, and if I'm 100% right, then I can. What do you mean? I'm allowed to tell her. I'm 100% right. That's exactly when you're 100% right, that's exactly when you have to be careful, because the more right you are, the more, chances are if you're 100% right, if you're really 100% right, then this person knows that he's wrong. And he's going to be embarrassed as it is, because you're already pointing out something to him that he did wrong. So that's exactly when you should do it, with a little, diplomatically. I always like to say that when you criticize, if somebody did something, criticize the action, don't criticize the person. So if somebody did something wrong, don't say you're not a nice person, or if somebody lies to you, don't call him a liar. If somebody is a thief, instead of calling the person name, just say, what you did is not really acceptable. Or what you said wasn't really the nicest things.
Or throw in a compliment for something else.
And right. Always pepper it with something good. You're a good guy, and I really like you.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely.
Is that a fly flying around?
He likes you better.
People like to make jokes and make fun of somebody, and they say, well, it's all in jest. But you got to be careful. As I always like to say, a joke is not funny if it's at somebody else's expense. That's why I was always very nervous, and I kept asking you guys when I made that plaque, because
I love the plaque.
All right, so I just have to.
I looked at it that you're thinking of me, and it means that you care about me,
okay.
And I was very touched by it.
Thank you, and you also have to,
And my wife agrees with everything that's on there.
Okay, so now we have a thing where it says that rather, you missed the beginning of this, Benny, but we talked about that it's better. We learn out from the story of Yehuda and Tamar that it's better to throw yourself in a fire than to embarrass somebody in public. It means you have to let yourself get killed. So according to this, the halacha is that if I go over to you and I say to you, Benny, either embarrass Tad or else I'm going to kill you, according to this, you have to let yourself get killed. Now, does that really make sense? So there are those that say yes. There are a lot of things that it talks about. It says that if somebody embarrasses somebody, he doesn't have a portion in the world to come. Now, if you kill somebody, you still have a portion in the world to come. If you commit adultery, you still have a portion in the world to come. If you embarrass somebody, you do not have. And not only that, the Tosfos says in Sota, it says that all those, we all sin, we all go to Gehenna, and after we're purified over there, we come out. Everybody comes out of Gehenna, except for 3 people, and one of the people that never come out of Gehenna is somebody who embarrasses somebody.
What are the other 2?
The other 2 is if you fail to make mock liver for 3 days in a row. It says. Okay, so the point is that, and the Gemara says over here also that rather, if you're about to sleep with a woman and you're not sure whether she's married or not, so you have a choice of doing that or embarrassing somebody, it says better sleep with that woman than embarrass somebody. So you see the severity of embarrassing somebody in public. Morgan?
We have the 3...
I'm not so sure that's the reason.
The 3 things that we should do, and
okay. Yeah, okay, so I'm getting to that. So the question is, if in fact it is so that we rather have to get ourselves killed for this, so what about the thing that we all know about? The Gemara talks about it all over the place, that there are 3 things that we have to allow ourselves to get killed and not violate. And the 3, one is murder. If somebody says, kill somebody else, I'll kill you. You have to allow yourself to get killed. If somebody says, worship idols or I'll kill you, you have to let yourself get killed. And the other one is to sleep with have an incestuous or another different forms of illegal relationships that you have to let yourself get killed. So if there are 3, why doesn't it say 4? According to this, there should be 4. So that's a big question that everybody asks, and there are many answers that are given for this. I'll give you a few answers. Okay, one of the answers is that when the Gemara says and when the Halacha says that there are 3 things, it talks about 3 things which the Torah specifically and clearly tells you you're not allowed to do. So those are 3 things. This one, obviously, the Torah doesn't say to you clearly. You only learn it out because it says you should reprove your friend and don't bear a sin. So we learn out from there that you shouldn't do it in a way that it embarrasses him. So that's why it doesn't mention that. But in fact, there is a 4th thing, and we only talk about 3 because those are the 3 which are prominent and clearly stated in the Torah. That's one answer to give. The other answer is what Tad said earlier, that when we say 3 things, we have to let ourselves get killed instead of violating the Torah. There are sub things in these 3 things. For example, there's all kinds of things when we talk about having an illegal, like having adultery, sleeping with a married woman. It doesn't necessarily mean just the ultimate act of intercourse. There are other things that you can do that falls into the same classifications. So the same thing with avodah zarah, worshiping idols doesn't necessarily mean that you go and you go into an idol and you bow down. There are other things that you do which are subcategories of worshiping idols. And the same thing, what Tad said, is that embarrassing somebody is a subcategory of murder. because when you embarrass somebody, his blood rushes through his body, he changes colors, and that's what happens to somebody who gets murdered. So that's why it only says 3, but in fact, this is a subcategory of murder, and you can't do it. And then there is...
So it's not 4, it's 3, but this
3, this is a category. Now the Rambam, interestingly enough, the Rambam says no. The Rambam says that if somebody points a gun to your head and says, embarrass somebody, otherwise I'm going to kill you, you better, he says, embarrass somebody.
Can you go explain to me
So
why
why
he did
the
it?
big difference in opinion?
Because he says, so they ask on the Rambam, how can you argue? It says in the Gemara, and there's nobody that disagrees with it. The Gemara says it in many, many different places. Nobody disagrees with it. The Gemara says, Noach lo la'adam, it is better for a person to throw himself into fire than to embarrass somebody. So the Rambam says, yeah, it doesn't say chayiv, you must do it. It says it's better if you do it.
But you say you lose your place in Gehenna. Like you'll be in Gehenna, you lose your place in Gan Eden. So that was better.
Okay, so, no, it says it's better to throw yourself into fire. The Rambam says that it doesn't say you must get yourself killed. It's better
The
to.
alternative is worse. Because if you're losing your place in the world to come.
No, but he says that okay, we'll get to that in a minute. We have 2 minutes, okay? So he says that it's better to do it, and therefore but if push comes to shove and you're about to get killed, he says you shouldn't do it.
Mendy,
But if you want...
You could go next day, explain to me why you did it.
Okay, let me just finish this because... Noch nicht, in 2 minutes. So the Rambam says that if you want to be this very holy, righteous person, and you really don't want to embarrass him, you can follow what the Gemara says, and it's better to allow yourself get killed than to embarrass somebody. But you don't have to. So there's only one big problem with the Rambam. The problem is that we have a rule that there are 3 things you have to get killed, but for any other thing you're not allowed to. If somebody comes over to you and says, you eat pork, or otherwise I'm going to kill you, you have to eat the pork. Mm-hmm. You can't say, I want to be a nice person. No, I love God. God says not to eat pork. I'm going to take the bullet in my head. You can't do that. So it's not a question that you can be a nice guy, you can be a holy person. There's 3 things you must do it, and for all the other 3 things, there's 613 mitzvahs, 3 things you have to give your life for, 610 you're not allowed to give your life for. So, according to the Rambam, what does he mean that it says you don't have to, but if you want to be, he says because the Gemara uses the word, it's better to do it, he says, but if you want to be a better person, then you can do it. But how can you do it? If you have to, then it falls under the category of those 3 things. But if you don't have to, then you're not allowed to. There's no middle ground. So how do we deal with this Rambam? So they give one answer. They give an answer that if somebody comes over to you and says to you, points a gun at you and says, eat pork, otherwise I'm going to kill you. So the rule is you must eat the pork. Why? Because the answer is because at that point your action of eating the pork was under so much duress that it's as if you didn't even do it. It's not you. You're a different person. So go ahead. So, but in a case like by Tamar, where she was burning by the stake, nobody told her, embarrass Yehuda, otherwise I'm going to kill you. She took it upon herself. So in those cases where nobody's forcing you to do it, and you don't want to violate the mitzvah, in those cases you can allow yourself to get killed and not violate, because it wasn't like somebody pointed a gun at you. I'll have to develop that more tomorrow. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.